Alrighty, we're getting ready to attempt a test fit. Just want to see how this thing's going to fit in the engine bay of the Travelette here. I pulled out the old transmission Crossmember. I was going to pull out the old engine Crossmember. This is that front one, but somebody, when they did this plow mount, they did that upright that you can see this guy, and that's welded right up to the engine Crossmember. So when the old Travelette here rolls down to the shop and I have an angle grinder that I can get at, then I can cut the welds and get that Crossmember out of there. I do want to save that because I'll be using that in the step side eventually. But yeah, we're just going to test fit, see how the 6.9 is going to fit in the engine bay, and figure out what kind of room we have to work with here. And hopefully I can get some preliminary measurements and an idea of how everything's going to work out. So yeah, I'm just going to get this thing up there. I got the engine leveler on it so that I can sort of hopefully snake it down in there. I really been avoiding taking off all the front stuff because it's just more work. But yeah, we'll see how she fits. Well, we hit the first hiccup. That's as high as this thing will lift. And there's two things I can do at this point. I could set the engine down and tighten up my chains. That'll pick the poles up. That was sort of my intent with the gin pole setup, was that I could always make them taller and get more height. But I think instead what I'm going to end up doing, I'm going to pull out the grill and the core support and all this nonsense, because the engine's going to have to go in and out a few times, so I want to know pretty good fitment and whatnot. So we'll just get this stuff out of the way, and then the engine can go in and out a few times. I'll probably still have to pick the poles up a little more. It's because I threw in the engine leveler on here is why it will not go high enough now. And I want to keep the engine leveler because I'm gonna need to snake the engine in there, and I'd like more control than if I were trying to use ratchet straps and all that shenanigans. So unfortunate, but we'll get through it. I'm gonna go ahead and just pull the grill out. That way it's out of the way for fitment and everything, and it'll be out of the way when I put the Crossmember in for the engine mounts and all that stuff. So something I knew I was going to have to do and was trying to put it off, but well, I have to do it now anyways. Got the grill out. Fortunately for me, this entire half of the grill wasn't even bolted in, so that made that easy. Obviously they replaced the grill, the fender, the hood, and that door with these white ones. The truck must have got hit at some point. But yeah, we're about ready to try and snake this 6.9 in. I'm thinking I should be able to get it up over this bumper. Obviously I'd take the bumper off, but it's all welded on. Same thing with that Crossmember. I'll just have to wait till it's down by the shop when I can get at it with a grinder and snip all of that nonsense out of the way. But this gives me a lot of open space to work with to get the old 6.9 thrown in. And yeah, then I just have to take a bunch of measurements and then pull the 6.9 back out, and then weld in the Crossmember for the 6.9, or weld bolt in the Crossmember, hopefully. If not, I'll weld it. It's not a big deal. But Crossmembers and then the 6.9 should be ready to sit in here for good. And then the big project comes where I'm just hooking everything up, making everything work, and doing all the nonsense. So away she goes. She was a bit of a pain to get over this plow mount, but we got her in there, and boy, if that doesn't just look right at home. I wonder how the shifter's gonna fit in here. Oh, that's pretty close. And that's about where the engine's gonna sit. Looks like if the engine goes forward like an inch, I can use the slip yoke here, or the drive shaft, without even adjusting it at all. That would be insane if that would work. Man, what a perfect match, just in every which way. I still haven't looked at I know the oil pan's gonna be tight. Well, that's not too bad, actually. What's gonna make this a weird fit is gonna be where because I have a stock IDI cradle that sat, and it looks like you can see the mount right there. So though fitting that cradle in here with the front axle is gonna be a bit of a challenge. But I think if the engine gets mounted like right there, I don't think the engine will ever hit that axle. Now, firewall clearance is going to be tight. I might take some time now and refit the firewall to the engine before I finalize the positions, but boy, so far everything just looks like it falls right into place. Alrighty, now she's coming on back out. I got my measurements for the engine mounts, so I can go ahead and start to graft the IDI cradle in here. Let me show you guys what I got. So over here, with various other things, this is the front frame rail section of a 84 F350. This truck was a rusty pile of junk. You can see the scaly rust here. The frame rails behind where I cut it off were just unspeakably bad. The truck was a cabin chassis, and when I got it, it didn't have a bed. The engine was locked up. So all I really ended up with, I sold a ton of parts from the thing, and I have this cradle and the two-wheel drive T19 that's going to go in that truck there is what I ended up with. So I've been planning this for a little while. But what I'm going to do with this guy is the International frame rails are a little more narrow than the Ford ones. Never mind all that wind. The International frame rails are more narrow, so I can cut this in to right in where the plates bolt on for the engine mounts, and then I can graft this into that truck, do a little trimming down below. These really don't need all this down here quite to that extent, but yeah, I'm going to make this fit in there, so I'll utilize stock IDI engine mounts in every way, and it should work out pretty decent. We'll just have to see how this fits in. It's always a guessing game with the front axle and where it sets. When I was measuring in the engine there, I had to put it a little closer to the firewall than I wanted to, just because of this rear sump oil pan gets too close to the front axle when the engine's forward where I'd like it. So she's going to be a little tight to the firewall. If I'm ever rich and put a turbo on this, it's going to be a tight fit, but I think I can make it all work out. But yeah, anyhow, get this thing out of here, and then I'll set it down and start planning to get the engine mounts in. You can see all my measurements that I took here, so I know about where I want this thing to sit. I am going to have the drive shaft shortened. It looks like it, and the U-joint's different. Shouldn't surprise me, but kind of did. So I'll either have to get a different yoke for that drive shaft, or I'll have to get a conversion U-joint to go from the bigger one on this transmission to that, or you know, whatever. I'll have to figure it out. But the IDI fits really good in there. I'm quite impressed. Well, there she is. I obviously hooked onto her with the old service truck here and wheeled this thing on down to the shop. So I'm going to open up the shop door, back this thing in. We'll get out the old gas axe and knock out all the rivets and get this cradle out of here. Get rid of all the brake lines, obviously. Couple other odds and ends, but nothing too. I got to pull these guys. So these are the this and this were the brackets for the old twin I-beam setup that the truck had. The F350 that this came out of, obviously. I got to get rid of these because my Travelette is not going to have twin I-beams because it's just not. And then I'm going to need that clearance for the front axle. Depending on my measurements, I'll just have to see how this fits in. I might have to trim the bottom of this cradle here some, but just kind of gonna have to wait and see. You know, this has got to be like the most reliable truck that I own. Perfect. Alrighty, I know the only thing you heathens wanted to see was the absolute fire and destruction that came from me using a torch, but too bad you don't get to see it. So I absolutely torched this whole thing apart. There were more rivets holding this 6 foot worth of frame together than the entire Empire State Building. This was way over engineered, but there's that part of the frame rail, there's the other part of the frame rail, other part of the frame rail. Those are the 2 shock towers. Those were actually the easiest thing to get off. They were only held on by 3 rivets. And here is the engine cradle. This is what I'll be using. This is the only thing I did all this for, but unfortunately I need most of the width of this for the Travelette. So I had to torch the whole frame rail off because the frame rail laid over like that. You can see the line where the frame rail was there. And over here you can see it slopes down, and that front portion is that right there. And that's actually where the steering box mounted on the Ford. So I'm gonna have to re-engineer this a little bit because the width of this is almost exactly the width that I need. So I'll notch in and down, and then I'll basically just bolt that to the top of the frame in the International. It's going to be a lot less strong than it was in the Ford. However, with the Ford, like I just said, the steering box was mounted right there. And the other thing that I removed, and they're floating around somewhere, these guys. So these guys were for the twin I-beams. The truck was a 2-wheel drive, so they were twin I-beams. If it was a 4-wheel drive F250, those would have been the twin traction beams. So basically, this engine cradle and section of frame rail that was here handles the torsion of the steering, the movement back and forth, or the torque of the steering, however you want to look at it. So there's a lot of power in your steering. There's a lot of torque coming from the engine, so it needs to be strong for the engine. And the way Ford had this designed is that the suspension also pivoted here and worked here. The coil springs would have gone into those big shock towers. And so there was a lot of force happening in this general area. When I put this in the International, it's got leaf springs that are sprung off the frame. The steering box is already there for the International. So suspension, steering, and everything else basically is already taken care of in that truck. All this needs to do is hold up and handle the engine power, which I don't think will be much of an issue if I just lay it down, if I can get it bolted to the top and maybe somehow attached on the bottom. I'd rather bolt this in than weld it, but if I have to weld it, it wouldn't be awful, so long as I can still get the engine out. And the other thing is I'll probably have to notch something on the bottom. I mean, this thing is pretty tall in all actuality, and it's gonna sit pretty close to my front axle. So I might end up having to notch this, but like I said, all this has to do is handle the engine. This doesn't have to handle the suspension and the steering like Ford had it designed. So I'm not too concerned about any of that. It'll just be a matter of getting this to fit in there. I'll probably have to cut this and bend this up so this has a flat plane, and then weld in some plate to fill in so that this has probably an equal distance on top of the frame rail as that side does. So it's going to be a little re-engineering, but I think in the end it's going to be less work than it would have been to completely build engine mounts and whatnot for the for the IDI. So anyhow, enough of that yakking on. I'm probably going to clean this up, obviously clean up the shop floor since I made an absolute mess. And then hopefully soon we'll be trying to test fit the Crossmember into the International, and we'll see how it plays out. Alrighty, well, I was having a look at this thing, doing a little bit of the old, mathematics, and I came to the realization that, well, it might be easier on camera for you guys to tell, but it took me a moment. Yeah, so I was thinking, oh, well, how does that all work out? I went up and had a look at another IDI up there at the old Turtle, and 6.9 IDIs aren't centered in the engine bay at all, which is totally a wonk theory to me that, like, you'd have an offset engine, but it is what it is. I reckon I'll just try and skedaddle this thing into the Travelette with the IDI will be a little bit over to the passenger side. Yeah, we're looking at this. This would be looking at the front of an IDI. And so the IDI will be shifted over a little bit to the passenger side, which isn't ideal in the Travelette because there's a big old heater box there on the passenger side. That's going to be kind of a pain, but I guess we'll just see how it works out once I get this in there, and well, we'll just figure it out as we go, just like everything else. So it's going to be interesting, though. I never really realized that they're offset a little bit, but something I guess I should have noticed, but well, way she goes. Alrighty, well, fresh from the Sawzall and the angle grinder, we've got this thing just about ready to test fit into the Travelette. Now, I want to stress the test part of this because I had to cut and flip this up so I have a nice flat surface. This will bolt onto the top of the frame, as well as this will go on top of the frame. So what I'll end up doing, if all this works out, is I'll cut a triangular piece to fit in here and weld in so that this guy isn't just flapping in the breeze, because obviously there's no strength in that. But this side turned out pretty good, and I left the ears down here. I'm hoping there'll be room to squeeze these guys in here and bolt them on the bottom side. But if it fits, I can show you in the truck and explain it a whole lot better. So let's go find out. Alrighty, well, when you're a half-wit like me and you take, half-assed measurements, this is what you end up with. I'm going to have to trim some more. I had it pretty close, but what I didn't account for is that you can see the International frame rail tapers in. For whatever reason, I didn't really think that I would be in the taper. I thought you can see the frame rail levels out and it's straight all the way back from there. I didn't think I'd be in that, but oh well. So some more preliminary measurements I'm gonna have to do away. There's no way I can be able to bolt this to the top and the bottom of the frame rail, so it's just gonna be bolted to the top. It's not like it's gonna be any weaker than the stock International engine mount. This is like half the thickness of steel, and it's just this little piece, so it's still probably going to be just as strong as the International mount. But yeah, so I've got it all plotted out, what all I need to cut out of here, and then this thing should nestle down. I have to take out this and fold it up level with this. I'll just have to weld it together up there, and then same thing, once this is up, I'll have to do a triangular piece, of course, to strengthen this little ear out. But well, I think she'll work out. We'll just have to keep at her. So back to the shop, more cutting, but I have a better idea now. And it is going to end up sitting a little bit to the passenger side, just like it was in the Ford. The Fords, I never noticed, but yeah, they're offset to the passenger side of the truck. So I'll have to account for that in this. I'll end up having to get a measurement of how far offset it is, but I'd like to account for it a little bit, but there's not really a whole lot I can do in terms of making it level, so it's just going to be what it's going to be. Well, since I did enough yakking about it, I figured I'd show you guys how the engine's not centered. You can see here's the center point of your Crossmember, so right there. So if we're looking right at it, you can see that engine's not quite centered. and I did the measurements earlier. So the radiator's centered. It was like 15.5 inches from there to there, 15.5 there to there. And if you look, the fan shroud is offset as well over to that side. So this is longer than this. The fan's not in the middle, the exact middle of the radiator. So kind of a funny thing that that Ford had done with the engine not being quite centered. And that's going to end up being the same way. The engine's not going to be exactly center. It's going to be a little bit over to the passenger side, which really isn't preferable with that heater box there. Hopefully I have enough room, although the heater box is cracked up there. Things can change if they need to, but it would be cool to keep the factory International style heater box. I should be able to patch up the fiberglass or find another one if I need to. But yeah, it's kind of weird. I think this chassis will accommodate the engine being a little bit offset. And what you do is the engine's offset straight back, so the transmission's off to the side back there as well, and then the pinion angles and whatnot line up. The drive shaft just runs a little bit sideways. Everything works out in its own way. Of course, Ford made it all work out. The Sterling 10.25 rear axles are centered and everything, so everything works out. It's just kind of curious that engineers, man, thank God I'm not one of them. Alrighty, my second and, well, final test fit of the night. I'm about to head home. You can probably tell it's raining now, so that's not really cool. But we got her nestled down in the frame there, which is pretty cool. It's almost where it's gonna sit. I think it's a little bit cattywampus there because, as I suspected, it is sitting right on the pumpkin there. So I am gonna have to, if you guys can see it all, I'm sure you can't because it's really dark in here now all of a sudden. But I'm gonna have to notch out the whole back side of this big cross member. But like I said earlier, I don't think I'm gonna even need, in terms of strength, this thing's gonna take a lot less stress than it ever did in a Ford because it doesn't have the axle pivoting off of it and the coil springs off of it and the steering box right here basically, you know, working on this thing. It'll all be pretty mint. But yeah, we got her in there, so now I just have to figure out really finishing the fitment of this thing, obviously notching the backside of it. I think I'm going to end up welding this plate on and getting rid of these two bolts because they're setting on top of the frame rail here. I don't want to notch or drill more holes than I need to into this frame rail, so these two are going to go away. I'm just going to weld this plate to the cross member as opposed to all that monkey business. It looks like the engine will be mostly centered in here, which is awesome. Kind of what I was aiming for. So yeah, a little more fitment still, but you know, away she goes with this kind of project. And well, so far so good. I'll keep on keeping on. Hopefully we'll get her here soon. You know, a true sign that your old project rig has been sitting around too long is when the old nature starts working around her. It ain't much, but that little tree's working around this old riggins. And well, if you ask me, this truck really hasn't even sat here this long, but that tells me it really has been sitting here this long. I think it's been 3 or 4 years this truck's been sitting here. What a shame. As you can tell, it's dark out again, as Alaska does in the fall time, but IDI's stabbed again. And not only that, but she's sitting there on her own weight. Let me get in a little closer and show you guys more about it. So as I just mentioned previously, I was going to torch out the back side of that cross member so that it clearanced the axle. Of course, that was really close to the axle and I wanted it to be a little better. So now I got that all taken care of, and I test fitted the old IDI in here. And things seems to fit all right, but what I'm noticing is it's canted to the, well, not really in a direction, but it's sideways. That valve cover is hitting the firewall. This one has a lot of space to it. So what I'm thinking is that the IDI engine mounts are not centered on each other, and I'm gonna have to do something about that. You can kind of see it here. It's a little dark out, but that valve cover's clear. That one's hitting that little bulb in the firewall, and this thing just doesn't, to me, it doesn't look centered at all. It's kind of that way, steered off. I think if you look down on the crank pulley there, you can see center's there, the water pump pulley's over there, as is the crank pulley. So this whole thing needs to go that way. And the way I'm going to need to do that is to torch out more on this side of that cross member so I can bring this side forward. I don't want to bring that side backwards because, like I've said before, I want all that clearance on the firewall. So more work, but away she goes. I got the air compressor up here and I blew all the water out of the glow plug wells there, and then this gloss that you see here is WD-40. I hosed this thing down something good. So I'll throw the hood back on this thing, and the 6.9 should be good to sit out here all winter. And we'll pick her up in the springtime or sometime in between. You guys will know when I pick this thing up again because there will be another video. So thank you guys for watching and following along. My apologies, this project isn't going, you know, as fast-paced as you'd probably like it, but dang old way she goes. So anyhow, thanks for watching, and until next time.